The first time I set foot in the attic, the house was silent, save for the occasional creaks and groans of the old Victorians settling into the night. I had always wondered what was up there in that forgotten corner of my landlord's home, with its narrow staircase leading to a door I had yet to open. Curiosity had finally gotten the better of me, drawing me up to the attic, the only part of the house I hadn't explored since moving in. Harold, my landlord, was a reserved man. In his 70s, he was quiet and observant, often watching the world around him with a thoughtful gaze that seemed to look beyond the present. We had a cordial relationship. He was kind in his own way, always offering a quick smile or a cup of tea on chilly afternoons, but there was a boundary he held firmly. I'd never crossed it until that night. The attic was filled with boxes, covered in a fine layer of dust, as if they'd been untouched for years. Old books, forgotten trinkets, and yellowed photographs were tucked away in every corner. A large window, partially obscured by cobwebs, cast a soft, dim glow over the space, making it feel as though time had stopped here. I moved slowly, my fingers trailing over the boxes, each one a glimpse into a past I could only imagine. As I sifted through the memories, I found myself entranced by the fragments of Harold's life. I was uncovering a photo of a young couple on their wedding day, a hand-bound journal, brittle with age, filled with a younger Harold's handwriting. I felt a strange sense of intimacy with this version of him I'd never known, an image of a man who had once loved, once dreamed. Lost in the past, I didn't hear the quiet footsteps ascending the stairs. It wasn't until the attic door creaked open that I looked up, my heart leaping into my throat as I saw Harold standing in the doorway. His eyes, usually soft and warm, held a spark of surprise and something else, something that seemed to mirror my own sense of discovery. "Didn't think anyone had come up here in years," he murmured, his voice soft, barely louder than a whisper. I felt my cheeks flush. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude, I was curious." He stepped into the attic, his movements slow, deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of the years he'd left behind here. "It's all right," he said, his gaze drifting over the boxes, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. "There's a lot of history here, things I haven't looked at myself in ages." We stood there in silence, the air between us thick with an unspoken understanding. I watched him, noting the way his gaze softened as he looked over the remnants of his past. There was something vulnerable in his expression, a glimpse of the man he'd once been, and for the first time I felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom in my chest, a strange, tender connection that I couldn't quite explain. "You were married?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I gestured to the wedding photo I'd found. He nodded, his eyes lingering on the photograph. "A long time ago," he replied, his tone tinged with a bittersweet nostalgia. "She passed away years back. But yes, we were happy." I felt a pang of sadness, a quiet ache for a past I hadn't been part of, but could sense in his words, in the gentle way he held that memory close. We continued to talk in hushed tones, sharing fragments of his life, stories of moments long gone. Each word felt like a brushstroke, painting a picture of the man he had been, and slowly I found myself drawn into the intimacy of his past. After a while he looked at me, his gaze lingering with a warmth that made my pulse quicken. "You remind me of her," he said softly. His words, simple as they were, held a gravity that seemed to echo through the quiet attic. My breath caught, and for a moment I felt the boundary between us blur, an inexplicable connection pulling us closer. I managed a small smile, the words he'd said resonating within me. "Thank you," I murmured, feeling the weight of his gaze as it settled on me, leaving a warmth in its wake that I couldn't quite shake. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine, hesitating before it rested gently on my shoulder. The touch was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a thrill through me, a sensation I hadn't expected, one that lingered even as he drew his hand away. We stood in the dim light, the silence around us deepening, each of us caught in the quiet tension that had somehow woven itself into the fabric of our connection. I didn't want to leave the attic, didn't want to break the spell of this moment, but eventually I felt the weight of the silence pull me back to reality. "I should go," I said, my voice breaking the quiet. Harold nodded, though his eyes didn't leave mine. "Of course. Good night," he replied, his tone gentle, filled with a warmth that felt almost intimate. I turned to leave, but as I descended the stairs, I felt the ghost of his touch lingering on my shoulder, the memory of his gaze haunting me, a reminder of the connection we had shared in the solitude of the attic. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about that night in the attic more than I cared to admit. Every detail replayed in my mind: the way his eyes softened when he looked at the photograph, the quiet vulnerability in his voice as he shared his memories, and the gentle warmth of his hand on my shoulder. It was as if that moment had left an imprint on me, one I couldn't ignore no matter how much I tried. Harold and I fell back into our usual routines, but there was a subtle shift between us, a quiet understanding that lingered in every glance, every unspoken word. I caught him watching me sometimes, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were trying to make sense of the same strange connection I felt. And in those moments when our eyes met, it was as if the world around us faded away, leaving just the two of us suspended in a silence filled with something unspoken. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a soft knock on the door. I opened it to find Harold standing there, his hands clasped together, a hesitant smile on his face. "I thought I'd check on you," he said, his tone light, though there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "Please, come in," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He moved carefully, his gaze drifting over the room as if he were taking in every detail. We sat down together, sharing a simple meal, our conversation easy and comfortable. He told me stories of the house's history, of the memories he'd built within these walls, each story revealing a little more of the man he was beneath the quiet, reserved exterior. As he spoke, I felt the invisible barrier between us slowly begin to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that felt both familiar and new. At one point, as he reached for his glass, his hand brushed mine. The touch was brief, accidental, but it left a spark in its wake, a reminder of the quiet tension that had been building between us since that night in the attic. I glanced up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air around us grew thick, charged with an unspoken longing that neither of us dared to voice. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence, though his gaze lingered on me with a warmth that made my pulse quicken. "It's nice, having someone around," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my own voice soft as I replied, "It is." The evening wore on, and as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, casting the room in a warm, golden glow, I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was a gravity between us, a quiet pull that seemed to defy logic, yet felt as natural as breathing. When it was time for him to leave, we stood by the door, the silence between us filled with a tension that had grown impossible to ignore. I felt his gaze on me, the warmth in his eyes mirroring the quiet yearning that had taken root in my own heart. "Good night," he murmured, his voice soft, filled with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "Good night, Harold," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. As he turned to leave, I felt an inexplicable urge to reach out, to stop him, to bridge the small distance between us. But I held back, watching as he walked away, his figure fading into the shadows of the night. I closed the door, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't fully understand. There was a part of me that wanted to push these feelings away, to deny the connection I felt, but another part, one that I couldn't ignore, wanted to explore it, to see where it might lead. The following week, a storm rolled in, filling the sky with dark clouds that cast the house in a dim, shadowy light. The wind howled outside, rain pelting against the windows as the storm raged on. I found myself restless, wandering through the empty halls, my thoughts drifting to Harold, to the quiet moments we had shared. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, I found myself climbing the stairs to the attic. I opened the door, the faint light from the window casting long shadows across the dusty boxes and forgotten relics. I moved through the space, my fingers trailing over the remnants of Harold's past, feeling a strange sense of connection to the man he had been, to the memories he held dear. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear him enter. It wasn't until I felt his presence behind me that I turned, my breath catching as I saw him standing there, his gaze filled with an intensity that took my breath away. "I thought I might find you here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I managed a small smile, my heart racing as I looked up at him. I didn't expect you to come up here. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. I suppose I was drawn here, he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability that mirrored my own. We stood there, the silence between us heavy, charged with a tension that had been building for weeks. His eyes held mine, his gaze searching as if he were trying to decipher the thoughts racing through my mind. And in that moment I felt the last of my reservations slip away, replaced by a sense of inevitability, a quiet understanding that whatever was happening between us was beyond our control. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The touch was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a shiver down my spine, igniting a warmth that spread through me like wildfire. "Harold," I began, my voice trembling, but he silenced me with a gentle smile. "We don't have to say anything," he whispered, his hand lingering against my cheek. His touch was warm, grounding, yet it held a tenderness that made my chest ache. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew that there was no going back. Slowly, as if testing the waters, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, filled with a quiet longing that mirrored my own. The world around us faded, leaving just the two of us in the dim light of the attic, caught in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. The kiss deepened, each touch, each movement filled with an intensity that had been building for weeks. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the connection that had grown between us. There was a rawness to it, a vulnerability that made every touch, every caress feel profound, as if we were discovering parts of ourselves we had long buried. The storm raged outside, the sound of the rain and wind echoing through the attic, but it only added to the sense of intimacy, the feeling that we were the only two people in the world. His hands traced gentle patterns along my back, each touch sending shivers through me, making me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. We broke apart only when we were breathless, both of us standing there in the dim light, our gazes locked, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a quiet fear that mirrored my own, and in that moment I felt a rush of emotions, desire, guilt, confusion, all mingling together in a tangled web I couldn't unravel. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible, his gaze dropping to the floor. I shook my head, reaching out to touch his hand, a silent reassurance that I felt the same, that whatever had happened between us was as real for me as it was for him. "Don't be," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. We stood there in the attic, the air around us thick with the weight of our shared vulnerability, each of us grappling with the reality of what we had done. And though I didn't have any answers, I knew one thing for certain: this connection, this quiet intimacy we had found, was something neither of us could ignore. The moments following our kiss hung heavily in the air, suspended in a delicate balance between desire and confusion. I could feel the heat radiating from Harold's body, a warmth that contrasted with the coolness of the attic around us. My heart raced, and yet I felt a calm settle over me, a sense of clarity amidst the emotional chaos. We were two souls navigating a storm, the outside world fading away as we stood together in that attic, our lives woven together in a tapestry of unspoken feelings. I watched as he processed the moment, his brow furrowing slightly as he searched for the right words. The vulnerability in his eyes mirrored my own uncertainty, yet there was a strength in the connection we had just forged, a bond that felt both fragile and unbreakable. "Can we just take a moment?" he finally said, his voice low and hesitant. "I don't want to rush into anything. This feels significant." I nodded, my heart swelling with the understanding that we were both navigating uncharted territory. "I agree," I whispered, stepping back slightly to create a little space between us, even though every fiber of my being wanted to stay close to him. "We don't have to define this right now. I need to understand what this means." Harold took a deep breath, his gaze drifting toward the window, where raindrops traced patterns against the glass. "This house has been my home for so long, and I've kept so much of my past hidden away," he began, his voice steadying as he spoke. "But since you moved in, things have changed. You've brought a warmth back into my life that I didn't know I was missing." His words sent a shiver down my spine, a warmth blooming in my chest at the raw honesty in his voice. I felt it too, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Living here has made me realize how lonely I've been. I didn't expect to feel this way, not with you. Harold turned back to me, his expression softening as our eyes locked once more. I never meant for it to happen like this, he said, his tone sincere. But I can't deny that there's something between us that I can't ignore. There was a tension in the air, an electric charge that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his presence anchoring me as we stood there, caught in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. What do we do now? I asked, the uncertainty lingering between us. I needed to know where we stood, what this meant for both of us. I think we take it one step at a time, he replied, his voice steady, the warmth of his gaze never wavering. I don't want to scare you away. I just want to explore this connection, see where it leads us, without expectations. His words wrapped around me like a comforting blanket, easing some of the tension that had settled in my chest. I'd like that, I said softly, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Let's just see where this goes. With that, the atmosphere shifted slightly, the weight of the moment transforming into something lighter, more hopeful. We stood together in the attic, the rain continuing to patter against the window, each drop a reminder of the storm outside, yet inside there was a warmth blooming between us that felt like a shelter from the chaos. I should probably get going, he said after a moment, his voice tinged with reluctance. But I'm glad we talked. It means a lot. Me too, I replied, feeling a bittersweet pang at the thought of him leaving. The attic suddenly felt too empty, too quiet without him close by. Good night, Harold. Good night, he said, a soft smile crossing his face as he stepped back toward the door. As he turned to leave, I felt a surge of boldness, a desire to keep him close just a little longer. Harold, I called softly, my voice echoing in the stillness. He paused, looking back at me, curiosity in his eyes. Would it be okay if we spent some time together tomorrow? Just to talk more, I asked, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. A smile broke across his face, brightening the dim attic. I'd like that, he said, his tone warm. Let's make it a date, shall we? Definitely, I replied, my heart fluttering at the thought. With that, he stepped out into the hallway, leaving me standing in the attic, filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The following day felt like an eternity as I waited for Harold to return. I busied myself with chores, my mind drifting back to the kiss we'd shared, to the warmth of his hand on my shoulder, the tenderness in his gaze. The connection we had forged felt like a fragile thread, and I found myself both excited and terrified of where it might lead. Finally, as evening descended, I heard the familiar creak of the stairs, my heart racing as I prepared for his arrival. When Harold stepped into the room, he carried an air of calmness, a quiet confidence that made me feel at ease. I brought some dinner, he said, holding up a small basket filled with homemade bread and cheese. Thought we could share a meal and talk, just like we said. I felt a rush of warmth at his thoughtfulness, my heart swelling with appreciation. That sounds perfect, I replied, moving to set the table. As we shared our meal, the conversation flowed easily, laughter spilling between us like the wine we enjoyed. We talked about everything, our lives, our interests, our hopes and dreams. Each word drew us closer, weaving an invisible bond that felt both exhilarating and frightening. With each shared glance and lingering smile, the tension between us deepened. I could feel the heat radiating from him, and I sensed that he felt it too, a magnetic pull that drew us together. After dinner, we settled into the living room, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls. We spoke quietly, our words punctuated by comfortable silences that felt rich with unspoken longing. At one point, as I gestured animatedly during a story, my hand brushed against his knee. The touch was fleeting but electric, sending a jolt of awareness through me. I quickly pulled my hand back, heart racing, acutely aware of the moment. Sorry, I murmured, a blush creeping up my cheeks. Don't be, Harold replied, his gaze steady, filled with an intensity that made my heart race. It's nice to feel that connection, isn't it? I swallowed hard, the air thick with the weight of his words. "It is," I admitted, feeling the warmth of his gaze washing over me, igniting something deep within. He shifted closer, the space between us dwindling as the tension in the air thickened. "I know this is complicated, but I want you to know that I care about you," he said, his voice low, filled with sincerity. "You make me feel alive again, and I can't ignore that." The weight of his confession hung between us, a delicate thread weaving a deeper connection. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and desire swirling within me. "I feel the same way, Harold, but I'm scared. I don't want to ruin what we have." He reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch warm and grounding. "We can take our time, there's no rush. We just have to be honest with each other." I nodded, feeling the comfort of his words wrapping around me. But even as I found solace in his reassurance, the undeniable chemistry between us was impossible to ignore. It pulsed in the air, filling the space with a tension that felt almost tangible. As the evening wore on, we found ourselves lost in conversation, each moment drawing us closer until the world outside faded into oblivion. The rain pattered softly against the window, creating a soothing backdrop as we shared our thoughts, our fears, and our hopes. And then, just as the conversation turned into something deeper, as I found myself leaning closer, the doorbell rang, slicing through the intimacy of the moment like a knife. We both paused, startled, the spell of our connection momentarily broken. Who could that be? I wondered aloud, glancing toward the door with disappointment gnawing at me. "I'll check," Harold said, rising from the couch, and I felt a pang of loss at the distance he created by standing. As he walked away, I took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions within me. I could feel the tension still lingering in the air, but the interruption had taken us off our path, leaving uncertainty in its wake. When Harold returned, his expression was slightly strained. "It was just a neighbor checking in. Everything's fine," he said, though I could sense the tension still lingering between us. "Good," I replied, forcing a smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our moment had been interrupted. We resumed our seats, the comfortable intimacy replaced by an awkward silence. I felt a wave of disappointment wash over me, and as the evening dragged on, I sensed the spark that had ignited earlier was slowly dimming. "I think I should get going," he finally said, his tone hesitant. "It's getting late." "Okay," I replied, trying to hide my disappointment. He stood, and I felt the space between us grow wider as he moved toward the door. "Thank you for dinner," he said, his gaze lingering on mine, the warmth returning briefly before it flickered away. "Thank you for sharing," I responded softly, trying to hold onto the connection we had built throughout the night. As he stepped out into the hallway, I felt a sense of loss, a longing for the intimacy we had almost grasped. "Good night, Harold," I called softly, hoping my voice conveyed the depth of my feelings. "Good night," he replied, and I watched as he disappeared down the stairs, the echo of his footsteps fading into the distance. Alone in the quiet room, I felt a mix of emotions swell within me: frustration, desire, confusion. The connection we had built felt tantalizingly close, yet painfully out of reach. I longed for the intimacy we had nearly shared, for the warmth of his presence that had filled the room, and I couldn't help but wonder what might have been if the night had unfolded differently. The next few days felt like a pendulum swinging between hope and frustration. Every time I saw Harold, the warmth in his gaze ignited a flicker of longing within me, yet the moment always seemed to dissolve before I could grasp it. Each casual conversation felt charged, the unspoken words hovering in the air between us, a palpable tension that seemed to thicken with every interaction. I spent hours replaying the moments we shared in my mind, wishing I could recapture that intimacy, that fleeting connection that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I found myself drawn to the attic more than ever, seeking solace in the remnants of Harold's past, feeling an inexplicable sense of comfort amidst the dust and shadows. On a particularly rainy afternoon, I decided to revisit the attic, hoping to sort through the boxes a little more thoroughly. As I climbed the stairs, anticipation bubbled within me, mixed with a hint of trepidation. What if I found something that sparked another moment between us? Once in the attic, I lost myself in the memories held within those boxes, pulling out old letters, yellowed photographs, and forgotten keepsakes. Each item told a story, and I felt a connection to Harold's past growing deeper with every piece I uncovered. Just as I was unearthing a particularly interesting journal, the attic door creaked open. I looked up, heart racing, to find Harold standing there, his silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze searching. "Not at all," I replied, feeling a rush of warmth at his presence. He stepped into the attic, closing the door behind him, and I could feel the tension that had built between us return, thick and heavy. Harold moved to my side, looking over my shoulder at the journal I was holding. "Ah, that was my grandfather's," he said, a hint of nostalgia creeping into his voice. "He used to write about everything, his dreams, his struggles. It's fascinating to read through his thoughts." I handed him the journal, our fingers brushing against each other as he took it. The simple touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt the familiar spark of connection that had ignited between us before. As he flipped through the pages, I studied him, taking in the way his brow furrowed in concentration and the warmth of his smile as he reminisced. There was something so intimate about sharing this moment, the closeness of our bodies, the air thick with unspoken words. "Have you ever thought about what you want to write?" he asked, glancing up at me, his eyes alight with curiosity. I hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. "I've always wanted to, but I never had the courage to try," I admitted, a touch of vulnerability creeping into my voice. "Why not?" he pressed gently, his interest genuine. "Maybe I was afraid," I confessed, the words spilling out before I could catch them. "Afraid of failing, afraid of what people might think." He set the journal down, turning his full attention to me, the warmth of his presence enveloping me like a comforting blanket. "You should never be afraid to share your voice. Everyone has a story worth telling," he said, his tone earnest. I felt a swell of gratitude for his encouragement, and in that moment it seemed as if the space between us had narrowed even further. The air was thick with possibility, each breath echoing the unspoken desires lingering between us. "Maybe you could help me," I suggested, a boldness rising within me. "We could write together." The suggestion hung in the air, charged with the weight of what it could mean. I held my breath, waiting for his response, my heart racing at the thought of collaborating with him, of delving deeper into the intimacy we had begun to explore. "I'd like that," he replied slowly, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "We could share our stories, learn from each other." As he spoke, I felt the warmth of his gaze settle over me, igniting the air between us once more. The weight of our shared vulnerability made my heart race, and I knew in that moment that we were crossing another threshold, a subtle shift in our relationship that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Our conversation drifted, weaving between dreams and fears, and as we shared more of ourselves, the connection between us deepened, each word wrapping around us like an invisible thread. I found myself leaning closer, drawn in by the warmth of his presence, the way his eyes sparkled with passion and sincerity. And then, in a moment that felt inevitable, I reached out, gently brushing my fingers against his hand. The touch was tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. Harold looked down at our hands, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. "Harold," I whispered, the sound of his name on my lips feeling like a plea, an invitation, a challenge all at once. He met my gaze, and in that moment I could see the conflict swirling within him, desire tangled with hesitation, passion fighting against the boundaries we had both tried to uphold. "Do you think it's too late for us?" he asked, his voice low and filled with a vulnerability that resonated deep within me. I shook my head, my heart racing as I leaned closer, our hands still touching. "I don't think it is. I think it's just beginning." His eyes searched mine, and I could see the tension building within him, the desire that had been lurking just beneath the surface. "I want this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it's complicated." "I know," I replied, feeling the weight of our shared hesitation, "but maybe that's what makes it so real. We're both feeling something we can't ignore." With a deep breath, he closed the distance between us, his hand wrapping around mine, the warmth of his touch igniting a fire within me. I could feel the electricity in the air, the anticipation building as our gazes locked once more. And then, in a moment that felt like a culmination of everything we had shared, he leaned in, capturing my lips with his in a kiss that was soft and tentative, yet filled with an intensity that took my breath away. Every lingering touch, every shared glance, all of it came rushing back in that moment, and I melted against him, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace. The kiss deepened, each movement igniting a fire within me, as if we were discovering a part of ourselves that had been hidden away for far too long. As the kiss intensified, the world outside faded into nothingness. It was just us in the attic, surrounded by memories and stories, our hearts racing in sync as we lost ourselves in the connection we had forged. I could feel the boundaries of our past dissolving, replaced by a raw, unfiltered desire that surged between us. But as we finally broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed, I felt a rush of reality wash over me. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of it pressed heavily on my chest. The thrill of the moment was tinged with uncertainty, and I could see it reflected in Harold's eyes. We shouldn't have, he murmured, his breath mingling with mine, the reality of our actions settling in. I know, I replied, a mixture of desire and guilt swirling within me, but it felt so right in the moment. He nodded slowly, his expression serious, filled with the weight of everything we had just done. What do we do now, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling within me. I don't know, I admitted honestly, but I don't regret it. Harold's gaze softened at my words, and I could see the conflict still lingering in his eyes, a mixture of desire and apprehension. I care about you, he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. But we have to be careful, this is complicated. I understand, I replied, my heart aching at the realization that our moment had left us both grappling with feelings we had never anticipated. I just need some time to process everything. He nodded, stepping back slightly to create a little distance between us, though his gaze remained locked on mine, filled with a warmth that made my heart race. Let's take our time, we can figure this out together. As we stood in the dim light of the attic, I felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty wash over me. We had crossed a line, one that had forever changed the dynamic between us, but the connection we shared was undeniable. The air still crackled with tension, filled with the promise of what could be, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. The storm outside had subsided, leaving a quiet stillness in its wake, much like the silence that hung between us now. I could feel the weight of our shared moment settling into the corners of the attic, and though the future was uncertain, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were embarking on something profound. And as we both took a step back into the reality of our lives, I knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Our journey was far from over, and I could only hope that we would navigate the complexities of our connection with grace, embracing the challenges that lay ahead, no matter how unexpected they might be. The days that followed our kiss were a whirlwind of emotions, an exhilarating mix of anticipation and uncertainty. I found myself oscillating between moments of bliss and those of doubt, wondering how we would navigate the intricate web of feelings we had woven between us. Harold and I continued our routines, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. Each glance felt charged, each touch lingering longer than it used to. I could see the struggle in his eyes as he wrestled with the reality of our situation, and I felt it mirrored in my own heart. We shared a tentative understanding that we were on a precipice, a fragile ledge from which we could easily fall. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked up to see Harold standing there, his expression serious yet warm. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. "Of course," I replied, gesturing for him to enter. The moment he stepped inside, I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, an electric connection that never seemed to wane. He moved closer, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze drifting around the room before settling on me. "I wanted to check in," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "about everything." My heart raced as I met his gaze, feeling the weight of the moment settle between us. "I've been thinking about it a lot," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's all so new and complicated." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I know I just don't want to rush into anything, but I can't ignore how I feel about you." The warmth in his words sent a thrill through me, igniting a spark of hope amidst the uncertainty. "I feel the same way, Harold. But what does this mean for us?" Harold stepped closer, closing the distance between us. The air around us felt thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "I think it means we need to be honest with each other about our feelings," he said softly, his gaze steady. "We can't ignore the connection we share." I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and exhilaration as I processed his words. "I want to explore this, to see where it goes," I admitted, my voice trembling with the weight of my confession. "But I'm scared." "Me too," he said, a small smile breaking through the tension. "But sometimes the things that scare us the most are the things worth pursuing." His words resonated deep within me, and I felt a rush of warmth at the thought of embracing this connection, despite the challenges it might bring. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice filled with hope. Harold reached out, gently taking my hand in his. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, igniting every nerve ending in my body. "We take it slow," he said, his thumb brushing softly over my knuckles. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We can just be together and see where this leads." I nodded, feeling the warmth of his gaze wrap around me like a comforting blanket. "I'd like that," I replied, my heart racing as I surrendered to the pull between us. As the weeks unfolded, our connection deepened, each moment shared filled with an intimacy that felt both exciting and daunting. We found ourselves spending more time together, sharing meals, laughing over old stories, and opening up in ways we hadn't before. Each shared glance, each lingering touch felt charged with a promise, and I reveled in the warmth of his presence. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a surge of gratitude for the moments we had shared. Harold's hand rested on the arm of my chair, his fingers grazing my skin ever so slightly, and I could feel the tension between us building once more. "Can I ask you something?" he said, suddenly breaking the comfortable silence. "Of course," I replied, turning to face him, curiosity piqued. "Do you think about the future?" he asked, his gaze serious. "About us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication, and I felt my heart race at the thought of what lay ahead. "I do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it scares me. There's so much we need to consider." He nodded, his expression thoughtful as he searched my eyes. "I don't want to put pressure on you, but I can't help but think about what it would be like to be with you, to share my life with you." A rush of warmth spread through me at his words, igniting a fire in my chest. "I want that too, Harold, but we have to be realistic. There's a lot we're navigating, our age difference, your past, my future." "I understand," he replied, his voice steady but filled with longing. "But I believe we can make this work. I want to be a part of your life." In that moment, the world around us faded away, leaving just the two of us suspended in time. I could feel the weight of his words resonating within me, filling me with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Harold," I started, but he interrupted me gently. "I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to miss the opportunity to be with you," he said, his gaze intense, filled with a longing that matched my own. The air between us felt thick with anticipation as I searched his eyes, sensing the depth of his feelings mirrored in my own heart. The tension was almost palpable, and I felt an irresistible pull toward him. "Then let's take it one day at a time," I said softly, my heart racing as I leaned closer. "We can explore this connection together, see where it leads us." His eyes softened at my words, and I could see the relief washing over him. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. In that moment, the world outside fell away once more as we leaned closer, our lips brushing together in a kiss that felt like a promise. It was soft and tentative at first, but as our connection deepened, the kiss ignited a fire within me, filling me with a warmth I had never known before. Every lingering touch, every shared breath pulled us closer, the kiss transforming into something deeper, more urgent. I could feel the passion between us building, each movement igniting a hunger I had long suppressed. As we pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, I could see the depth of emotion swirling in Harold's gaze, a mixture of desire, vulnerability, and something deeper that sent my heart racing. "Wow," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. "That was incredible." He chuckled softly, a warm smile breaking through the tension. It was. We sat together on the porch, the warmth of the evening wrapping around us like a comforting embrace. I could feel the weight of the moment settling in, the realization that we had crossed yet another threshold, a line that had irrevocably changed the nature of our relationship. But even amidst the thrill of our connection, there was a lingering uncertainty that tugged at my heart. What would this mean for us moving forward? Could we truly navigate the complexities of our feelings, the challenges that lay ahead? As I looked up at Harold, I could see the questions reflected in his eyes as well, a silent understanding passing between us. We had crossed a line, and now we had to figure out what that meant for our future. The storm clouds from earlier had passed, leaving a clear night sky overhead, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of hope blooming within me. Whatever challenges we might face, we would confront them together, and in that moment I knew I was ready to embrace whatever came next. As the evening wore on, we talked and laughed, the tension between us still palpable but tempered by the warmth of our connection. I could feel the stirrings of something profound taking root, and I knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would forever change us both. In the days that followed, we continued to explore the boundaries of our relationship, our connection deepening with every shared moment. We navigated the complexities of our feelings with cautious optimism, each encounter filled with the thrill of discovery and the weight of what we had begun. Yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were treading on uncertain ground, that the very connection that brought us together could just as easily pull us apart. And as the weeks turned into months, I found myself grappling with the reality of our situation, the challenges we faced, the emotions that swirled around us like a storm. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, and I couldn't help but wonder how it would all play out in the end. But for now, I chose to embrace the journey, to savor every moment we shared, knowing that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, hand in hand. As the weeks turned into months, Harold and I settled into a rhythm that felt both exhilarating and daunting. Each day brought new challenges, new moments of intimacy, and new uncertainties that weighed heavily on my heart. The connection we had forged in that attic blossomed into something deeper, yet I found myself constantly wrestling with the implications of our relationship. We continued to spend time together, sharing meals and stories, each moment steeped in a warmth that made the outside world feel distant. Our laughter filled the house, echoing off the walls and creating a sense of home that I hadn't realized I was missing. Yet, beneath the surface, I felt a growing sense of tension, a silent struggle, as we both navigated the complexity of our feelings. One rainy afternoon, as we lounged on the couch, the sound of raindrops pattering against the window creating a soothing backdrop, I found myself lost in thought. Harold sat beside me, a book in hand, but I could sense his awareness of my restlessness, the way I shifted slightly, the way my fingers fidgeted with the hem of my shirt. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking over at me, his brow furrowed with concern. I hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the whirlwind of emotions swirling within me. "I'm just thinking," I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "About us?" he asked, his gaze steady, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. I nodded slowly, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "It's just that. This feels so right, yet it also feels so complicated. I can't help but wonder what the future holds for us." Harold set his book down, turning to face me fully. "I understand," he said, his tone gentle yet firm. "But I don't want you to feel trapped or pressured. We can take this at whatever pace you need." The sincerity in his voice sent a shiver down my spine, but I also felt a pang of sadness. I knew that the very connection that had brought us together also carried the risk of unraveling everything we had built. "It's not that I don't want this," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I just worry about the implications. People will talk. It's not exactly conventional." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. This isn't something society typically accepts, but I believe what we have is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. His words struck a chord within me, igniting a flicker of defiance against the fears that had held me captive. "I want to embrace this, Harold," I said, my heart racing. "But I also don't want to hurt you or cause trouble." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "Whatever happens, we face it together. We can figure this out, one step at a time." The warmth of his words enveloped me like a comforting embrace, filling me with a sense of hope that I desperately needed. "You're right," I said, a small smile breaking through the tension. "We'll take it slow and see where this leads." Days turned into weeks, and as we continued to explore our relationship, the connection between us grew even stronger. We found solace in the small moments, cooking together, sharing books, and laughing over silly jokes. Each interaction felt charged, filled with the weight of everything we had shared and the promise of what was yet to come. Yet with each passing day, the realities of our situation loomed larger. I could see the unspoken questions in Harold's eyes, the uncertainty that hung between us like a fragile thread. And though I wanted to push those fears aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living on borrowed time. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the world in shades of orange and pink, I felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on my heart. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, and I could sense the tension building between us, a mixture of desire and uncertainty. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked over at me, his expression serious. "All the time. I want to believe we can make this work, but I also know there will be challenges ahead." I nodded, feeling a pang of apprehension in my chest. "I don't want to lose what we have, but I also don't want to be the source of your pain or regret." He reached out, taking my hand in his touch warm and grounding. "You won't lose me, I promise. We just have to navigate this carefully." The sincerity in his voice soothed my racing heart, and I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. "I want to be with you, Harold. I want to embrace what we have, even if it's unconventional." A smile broke across his face, and I could see the warmth in his gaze as he squeezed my hand. "Then we take it one day at a time, together. We'll figure this out." And so we did. In the weeks that followed, we continued to explore the depths of our connection, savoring each moment we shared, even as the world outside felt heavy with judgment and uncertainty. We laughed, we cried, we opened up to each other in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Yet, as our bond deepened, so too did the weight of our circumstances. I could feel the tension in the air, a silent reminder of the complexities we faced, the reality that loomed over us like a shadow. Each moment we spent together felt precious, yet it was tinged with a sense of urgency, a reminder that our time might be fleeting. One fateful evening, as we sat together on the couch, the weight of our shared emotions settled heavily in the air. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across the room, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt charged with possibility. "I think we need to talk," Harold said, his voice low, filled with a seriousness that made my heart race. I nodded, my stomach twisting with anxiety. "About what?" "About us. About what we're doing and where we're headed," he replied, his gaze steady as he searched my eyes. "I need to know if we're on the same page." I took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. "I want this, Harold. I really do," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "But I also worry about what happens next. The world isn't exactly kind to people like us." He nodded, the weight of my words sinking in. "I know, but I believe in what we have, and I think we can navigate this together, no matter how unconventional it may seem." Tears pricked at my eyes as I felt the sincerity of his words wash over me. "I don't want to lose you," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I felt so alone for so long, and you've brought light back into my life." "I don't want to lose you either," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But we need to be honest with ourselves about the risks we're taking. This isn't something to be taken lightly." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "You're right. We need to figure out how to navigate this world while still being true to ourselves." As we sat together, the gravity of our situation weighed heavily in the air. I could feel the tension building between us, a mixture of fear and longing, and I knew that we were at a crossroads. But even amidst the uncertainty, I felt a flicker of hope igniting within me. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, hand in hand, navigating the complexities of our emotions with honesty and love. And as we leaned closer, the warmth of his presence enveloping me, I realized that I was ready to embrace whatever came next, ready to forge a path forward, even if it meant venturing into the unknown. The next morning I woke to the sound of rain pattering against the window, the air thick with the scent of earth and fresh beginnings. I felt a renewed sense of determination wash over me, a quiet resolve to embrace the journey ahead, no matter how complicated it might be. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. I found myself restless, unable to focus on anything but the weight of my thoughts. It felt as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to reveal its plans. When Harold arrived that evening, I could see a hint of tension in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that made my heart race. I knew we needed to talk, to confront the reality of our situation once more, but the words seemed to hang in the air, unspoken yet palpable. We sat together in the living room, the silence stretching between us as we both searched for the right way to broach the subject. The flickering candlelight cast soft shadows across the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt charged with possibility. "Can we talk?" he finally said, breaking the silence, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "Of course," I replied, my heart racing as I braced myself for the conversation we both knew was coming. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, his gaze steady as he searched my eyes, "about what this means, about the future." I nodded, feeling a rush of emotion wash over me. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want this, Harold, but I'm scared." Scared of what? He asked gently, his expression filled with understanding. "Scared of how people will react. Scared of the complications that come with our relationship," I confessed, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to hurt you." He reached out, taking my hand in his touch warm and grounding. "You won't lose me," he said softly. "We'll navigate this together, but we have to be honest about what we're facing." As he spoke, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "We need to figure this out. I want to explore what we have, even if it's unconventional." "Then let's take it one step at a time," he replied, his gaze filled with warmth and determination. "We can figure this out together, no matter how challenging it may be." With that, I felt a renewed sense of hope blossom within me, a quiet determination to embrace the journey ahead, even if it meant facing the unknown. As we sat together in the dim light, I realized that we were on the brink of something profound, a journey filled with challenges, growth, and the possibility of love that defied convention. And I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, hand in hand, navigating the complexities of our emotions with honesty and grace. In that moment, I felt a surge of gratitude for the connection we had forged, a bond that had blossomed amidst the shadows of uncertainty, illuminating the path ahead with the promise of love, acceptance, and the courage to embrace whatever the future held.